Hello, welcome to Book Nook. My name is Mary Kay Bond, and I'm Executive Director of Read Aloud West Virginia. I'm delighted you've joined us today because my guest today is Sarah Sullivan, a dear friend and also a wonderful author. She has really put West Virginia on the map. Her most recent book was recently reviewed by the New York Times. And welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Mary Kay. It's good to be here.
I'd like to spend a little bit of time today talking about how it is you came to be an author. One does not just wake up one day and say, I'm a writer. So how did that work with you? Did you know?
Well, I think when I was a child, I think it was probably about the time I was in 5th grade. And 5th grade is when, if you are a reader, you really start getting lost in books and lost in stories and characters. And it was sometime around then, 4th or 5th grade, I read the Betsy and Tacy stories. And they're rather old-fashioned these days, but I love them. And Betsy is a character, a little girl who wants to be a writer when she grows up. And she has a treehouse in her backyard, and she writes stories on tablets from her father's shoe store. In one story, she has an uncle who's an actor, and he's sent home a theatrical trunk, and so her mother creates a writer's desk for her out of a theatrical trunk. And I just thought that was the most magical thing I could possibly imagine. So I think it began there, just wanting to tell stories. I loved reading, and so I wanted to do that. I got sidetracked a little while because I also wanted to be a lawyer, and I've been lucky to be able to do both. So
it's interesting, we had Fran Cannon-Slayton on recently, and she also is an attorney who became a children's author. And I wonder if lawyers like words and deal in words, so they
It's very common. I think you see that so often, and of course there are people like John Grisham and Scott Turow who write legal thrillers. I think part of what it is, part of it's a love of words and being a verbal person, and that goes hand in hand with practicing law. But I think the other thing is a lot of what law is making order out of chaos, and particularly if you do any trial work at all, you're presented with a set of facts. If you have witnesses, each witness is a point of view and has a different story. And so as an attorney, your job is to tell the story of your client from your client's point of view, and you are imposing order on chaos. That's really what writers do. If you tell a story, you need to find the point of view from which you want to tell it. And you need to organize all the facts into a logical narrative. So I think there's certain personality traits that are true, that are common for both lawyers and writers. And so lots of attorneys want to be writers.
Well, it is interesting how many attorneys do later on make that career switch.
And lots of them in children's books, interestingly enough.
Really?
Yeah.
That is interesting. I know of some, but I was thinking of John Grisham as an attorney writing the legal thrillers. But you actually made this switch from law to writing. Now, I'm assuming that you'd been writing all along throughout high school and college.
Secretly, not so much in college. I was a language major in college, and so I was sort of immersed in. I studied French, German, and Spanish, and I was leaning towards law. So I kind of got away from it then, but then once I got out of college, I was right back to secretly writing. I would spend vacations at writers' conferences, and then I fell in love with children's literature all over again as a parent, I guess. I was reintroduced to it. In the 80s, picture books just took off because of advanced technology. The art was just fabulous. It was so exciting to see what was happening then, and I fell in love with those books all over again.
I know from reading your blog that Lois Lowry is a particular favorite of yours, and you love Patricia Polacco as well. Have they been influential in your career?
They have. So many have. Catherine Patterson. Lois Lowry amazes me because she seems to reinvent herself, or just she's in her mid-70s, and yet everything she says is as up-to-date as any young person would be. And she's publishing new books. Her books change with the time. She, of course, became famous for The Giver now, 25 years ago. She had a book recently called Gossamer, which was made into a play. So I love watching what happens with people like that, and they definitely influence me. I think what really excites me about their work is that, people always ask children's writers, are you ever going to write for grown-ups? Are you ever going to graduate and write a real book? Which is a real pet peeve for anyone who writes for young people, because for our point of view, how many books are there that stay with the person from the time they're 6 years old until they reach the grave? I mean, everyone, if they are literate, probably has a book that they remember reading as a child that probably shaped who they are as a person, and how a form of writing can be more significant or important than that, I can't imagine. So now I've lost my train of thought, but I think part of why I admire the writers who write for young people is that they understand that, they respect their audience, and so the books reflect that.
It's interesting. You talked about The Giver, written by Lois Lowry, and I just spoke with a young woman, 23 years old, who reads it every year.
Oh, that is
and she started in 5th grade, and she said, I read it again this year, and she was sharing it with some students in her life, and she said, I realize that every year I read it, there is a different meaning I take away from it. And I was struck by that, and how there is such a partnership between the listener or the reader, and if someone is reading aloud to someone, the listener and the reader and the author. And the experience I get from it or you get from it will be different depending upon our stage of life.
That's so true.
And this is a book that has stayed with her for all these years, and I suspect will, as you say, until the day she dies.
That's right, that's right. And so what higher aim could you have than to aim for something like that?
I travel around the state a lot, as you know, and it's very interesting in talking to adult groups. I often ask if they remember a favorite childhood book, and the minute they remember it, I can see it in their eyes. And most of them talk with such affection about this book, and if they've lost the book and it's out of print, they ask if I know of any way they could possibly locate it, because it is such a treasure. So clearly it is very important that we have good children's authors, and you are one of those. You recently published your 4th book. I know you started with Root Beer and Bananas. That was your first book published when?
2005.
Okay. And then Dear Baby, which just went into paperback, you said.
No, just reprinted.
Reprinted. I'm sorry. Which tells the tale of a big brother writing to his soon-to-be sibling, trying to figure out exactly what their roles are going to be, and kind of trying to shepherd this new baby.
Yeah, he starts 3 weeks before she's born, and then it goes up into her first birthday. And there are 1 or 2 letters each month, and so it's the ups and downs. Sometimes he really loves her, sometimes she's the biggest pain in the world, and it's just sort of dealing with the experience of sharing your family with a new sibling.
And I think every child can identify with that. Probably every adult, because they remember those sibling rivalries. And then you carried that sibling rivalry theme over here into this 3rd book, Once Upon a Baby Brother.
I know, my husband wonders what's going on.
And we see a budding author. Was that inspired by your own experience?
I'm sure it was, because I did write stories when I was a child. I think as soon as I started 1st grade, I started writing stories. But really, I don't know how this reflects on psychological welfare of children's writers, but honestly, a lot of it comes from what happens today, and that's turning the bad things that happen to you into stories. One of my favorite sayings comes from Nora Ephron, and that's, it's all copy. And she actually got it from her mother, who was a screenwriter, and says that when she was growing up, anytime something bad happened, her mother would say, oh, it's all copy, meaning just put it in a story, use it. And so that's really what Lizzie does. Lizzie in the story has this little brother named Marvin who drives her crazy. He squeezes toothpaste all over the counter. He puts glitter all over her favorite stuffed bear. And so she turns him into characters in her stories. And when he goes off to visit Grandma, all of a sudden all her story ideas dry up. So she realizes that what seems to be something bad actually can be something very good.
And I think that's a good message for the students that you visit. I know you travel around visiting schools, and you can talk to students because I'm sure they have those little mini emergencies and mini crises or major crises in their lives that they can use as copy and learn to cope with and control.
I just recently did some workshops in New Jersey in the fall, in a school in New Jersey. And I used Once Upon a Baby Brother, and one little girl, I think she was in 3rd grade, and she wrote it was a wonderful story. She wrote it in about half an hour. And apparently she had been charged with keeping watch over her little sister, maybe a toddler, not a baby. And she got distracted. And all of a sudden, no one could find the baby sister. And it all turned out all right in the end. She had wandered outside and found a little cubbyhole where she was hiding. But I could see that this young writer had made the connection between experiences in her life and putting them in stories, which is what I hope will happen when I do workshops in schools.
And right before we went on air, you told me a lovely story about a young woman who, actually a teacher of students who are blind, said that this was such a favorite book for a child who had heard it. It had been read to her repeatedly, apparently, and she asked to have it
They typed into Braille so that she could read it herself. I was so touched by that story. I haven't had a chance to tell my editor yet, but I was really excited. I'm pleased and honored to hear that.
What lives you are touching. Well, now, one of the reasons we wanted you to come today, besides to talk about your previous books, is to talk about the most recent book, and I referred to that at the beginning of the program. It was just recently reviewed by the New York Times, and that is a wonderful kudo for any author to be reviewed in the New York Times Review of Books. And this is truly a West Virginia story. I know it was many years in the making, and I wonder if you can tell us what exactly led to you choosing this storyline.
Honestly, this story chose me. I can say that easily. It's based on 2 real people, Melvin Wine and Jake Crack. Melvin was from Braxton County. He was an old-time fiddle player. He came from a long line of musicians in Braxton County. And Jake was a young boy growing up in Indiana. He loved old-time fiddle music. And his teacher in Indiana said, you ought to get your parents to take you back to one of the music festivals in West Virginia, North Carolina, to hear the old-time fiddle players play, because they have a unique style of fiddling. And when they die, their music will go with them. It's passed down solely by oral tradition. Mm-hmm. So Jake did get his parents to bring him to Cliff Top in West Virginia, Washington Carver camp, and he met Melvin. And he had learned one of Melvin's songs. He had a recording of Melvin playing. And so Melvin said, do you know any of my songs? And Jake played, I think it's Peg and All is the song that Jake played for him. And Melvin said to Jake's parents, you ought to bring that boy to see me. And so they did. And they made a number of trips from Indiana to West Virginia to Melvin's farm in Braxton County. And the art, Barry Root is the artist. The art's magnificent in this book. I love it. And this is very much like the farm that Melvin lived on. So over the next year, they made a number of trips, and finally Jake's parents actually moved to West Virginia. His mother took a job as librarian at Charleston Catholic. They live in Calhoun County, and Jake became formally apprenticed to these old-time fiddle players. Melvin, another man named Lester McCumbers, who's still living. Melvin passed away in 2003. And he studied also with Bobby Taylor, who's very much alive and runs the archives library at the Cultural Center. And I was just fascinated by this story because I had been fascinated by Melvin, and it just was so unusual for an apprenticeship like that to exist in real life, and for a young man to study an art that was passed down solely by oral tradition. So I wanted to tell that story, and that's how it began.
And for a whole family to uproot itself for
Exactly.
so that this